How can I convert from my E-2 status to a green card, and what's the best way to do that? Folks, today we're going to talk about that topic a little bit in this video, where we're going to go into more detail as to how you can move from your E-2 to a green card, what are the best options, and from our 20 years of experience, what has worked for our clients. Again, my name is Charles Raether. I'm the managing partner here at AmLaw Group, where we do everything related to business investor migration to the US to make your transition here as successful and pain-free as possible. So here's one scenario that comes up a lot of times. Client got his E-2 visa. They've been here for a while. They like it in the US. Business is going well. Everything's great. They want to get a green card. I should ask, what's the most direct way of doing this, and what's the easiest or most popular route of doing it? Spoiler alert, there's no best route here. It really depends on your particular circumstances and background. So I can't say this is the best route. Now, if you were to ask me what's the most direct route, the most direct route would probably be to use that E-2 business and file for an EB-5. Even though that's the most direct route, in my 20 years of experience, I don't think we've ever had a client who's gone that route. Maybe one, but I don't think so, if I'm not mistaken. If that's the most direct route, you would think, why do more people not do that? And I guess there's a lot of reasons why. I've never asked clients, but I think the reason is just because when you're going from an E-2 business to an EB-5 business, that generally entails a large scaling up of operations and scaling up of investments. E-2 requires about 100,000, EB-5 requires at least 800. E-2 doesn't even require any employees. EB-5 requires at least 10. So as you can see, we're talking about materially different, significantly different types of businesses here. And it's generally, if a client has a business that works for an E-2, from my experience, it's difficult to expand that to the needed level you have to get to for an EB-5. The one exception might be is maybe if you have a restaurant chain and you open one restaurant or franchise to start with initially, at 100,000, 200,000, and you expand it to a second location and a third location and a fourth location. Sure, at that point, you certainly have 10 employees, I'm sure, and you probably almost certainly have invested 800,000. So that's one and probably the only scenario that I can think of where it is relatively easy to go from an E-2 level size of business to an EB-5. But unfortunately, the majority of our clients do not have multi-location businesses where they can easily scale up from an E-2 to an EB-5. So what do people do instead when they're in an E-2 and they want to try to move over to a green card? And that's where I said earlier that there's no easy answer, because there isn't. It really depends on each client's background, their circumstances, whether they have businesses overseas, etc. We can quickly run through some of those options, but you're probably familiar with most of them, right? So if you have a lot of talent, if you have some talent or your spouse is very talented, you could look at an EB-1A or an NIW. You could look at an EB-2 or an EB-3, employment-based green card. Those are taking a long time now, probably 2 to 3 years and even longer because of the backlog. So it's not a very appealing option. And especially if you're from India or some other countries that are retrogressed, that's really not an option to realistically consider at all. EB-1C could work if you had an overseas business that you worked at prior to moving here in your E-2. The biggest challenge of going from an E-2 to an EB-1C is you're going to have to file your EB-1C within 2 years after you enter the US on that E-2. There's a reason for that. We can go into those details later, but that's the only restriction, is you've only got 2 years from your entry to file that EB-1C. Sometimes that could be a challenge for clients. And the other option, I guess, like I said, is an EB-5, but maybe not through your E-2 business, but maybe a regional center investment. And we do see a lot of clients start out with an E-2. It gets them here relatively quickly, gets the family here, kids can start going to school, they can get acclimated, see how things are going. And if things go well after the first year or two and the clients enjoy it, we have a lot of clients actually that start with an E-2 and then go to an EB-5 through a regional center investment, not their own business. As much as they know their business, and no matter how well their business in the US is going, generally it's just difficult for clients, like we said, to ramp up to 10 employees and increase the total investment to at least 800,000. So those clients tend to start with an E-2, they have that in their back pocket, and then they start the EB-5 process with a regional center. God forbid, but if there's any problems with the EB-5, they can always refile. They always have their E-2 to fall back on, and we can reassess things if there's any challenges and decide how to go from there. So hopefully this gave you a little flavor of what options are available to you if you're currently in an E-2 status and looking at other green card options. Best solution is always to have an individualized consultation with an experienced attorney, yours truly, or any other attorney that you might find. But we'd be more than happy to assist you and guide you on the process and how to best make that transition.